Lakota chief burned with a fever. No medicine would break. A white healer cooled him and stayed. The candle stub was burning when she walked in. A tallow stub no bigger than my thumb, and I had been watching it the way a man watches the last coal in a fire, not wanting to look away in case it goes out while he's not watching, as if his attention is the thing keeping it alive. I couldn't move much. 3 days into the fever by then, maybe 4. Time had gone soft on me. I would wake and it would be dark, then wake again and it would be dark still, and I couldn't tell if it was the same night or a different one. My body hurt in places I hadn't known were there. The joints of my fingers, the backs of my eyes. There was a weight on my chest that wasn't a weight. Nothing was on me. My men had pulled the robes off because of the heat, but I felt it all the same, like something pressing. My name, the one the soldiers wrote in their ledgers, was Joseph. The name my father gave me, the real one I will not say here. But among my people I was called something that means the one who holds the line. It was given to me young, after a thing that happened at a river crossing, and I had tried to live up to it for 50 years. 50 years of being the one who holds the line. I was not holding much of anything those 4 days. Broken Bow had tried everything. He was our medicine man, had been since before I could remember, and he was not a man who panicked easily. But I saw his face on the second morning. He thought he was keeping it from me, but I was watching, and what I saw, there was a man who had run out of roads. He had burned the sage. He had used the cedar smoke and the prayers I had heard him say over others. He had made the tea from the bark my grandfather's grandfather had known. Nothing touched it. The fever just sat in me like it owned the land. My men came and went. They did not say much. Warriors are like that. When one of their own is going down, they don't know what to do with their hands, so they stay quiet and they come to sit for a while and then they go. Red Cloud sat with me an entire afternoon without saying a word. Just sat. That meant more to me than anything he could have said. The woman arrived at night. I didn't see her come in. I heard the lodge flap move and felt the cold air off the plains come in with her, and I opened my eyes and she was there. Standing just inside the entrance, holding a leather bag against her chest, looking at me the way a person looks at a problem they're trying to figure out. Not frightened, not pitying, just looking. She was not young, maybe 40, maybe a few years either side. Fair hair going gray at the temples. She had a square kind of face, wind burned the way anyone's face gets out here, and her hands, when she set the bag down and opened it, were hands that had worked. Rope-reddened knuckles, short nails, the hands of a woman who had been useful her whole life. I found out later that one of my younger men, a boy named Little Thunder who had more courage than sense, had ridden out to the trading post 2 days back and told anyone who would listen that the chief was dying. He wasn't supposed to do that, but I couldn't be angry at him for it. She had heard him. She'd been at the post 3 days waiting out a storm, and she'd heard this boy's broken English and come. I didn't know any of that yet. I just watched her open the bag. She had glass bottles, small ones stoppered with cork, a roll of clean cloth, a tin cup that caught the candle light. She looked at me and said something English which I understood well enough, though I hadn't spoken it much in years, something about how she needed water boiled. I said nothing. I couldn't tell if I said nothing because I was past talking, or because I was deciding whether to trust her. Broken Bow was in the corner of the lodge. I could feel him there without looking. He had not left since the night before. She said it again about the water, and this time she said it to the room rather than to me, and Broken Bow, after a moment I could feel but not see, went out to get it. That was the first thing I noticed about her. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't make a speech about who she was or why she was there or what she was going to do. She just started working. Opened 2 of the bottles, smelled them, put one back, kept the other. Unrolled the cloth. Poured water from her own canteen into the tin cup and set it near the stub of candle to warm. She pressed the back of her hand to my forehead. I felt the coolness of it, and I think I made a sound, just some small sound in my throat, because I hadn't felt anything cool in days. She didn't comment on that, just pressed her hand there for a moment, then moved it to my neck, feeling along the jaw. Her face stayed even. She was reading something. She said, "You've been sick 4 days." I said, "I don't know." She looked at me, really looked the way I said, and then she nodded and went back to what she was doing. Broken Bow came back with water and she had him heat it, and then she mixed something into it, the contents of 2 of those small bottles, careful amounts, counted, and she held the cup to my lips and said, "Drink this and don't think about what it is." And I drank it, and it tasted like something between pine bark and river mud, and I did not think about what it was. That is the beginning. What comes after is harder to tell straight, because the night that followed was not straight. The fever went higher before it went lower, and there are hours in it I can only tell you in pieces, the way you tell a dream after you've woken. This happened, then there was a gap, then this. I remember her voice. She spoke while she worked, not to me exactly, not always, just a low, steady talk, the way you talk to a spooked horse. I couldn't follow all of it. Something about the weather, something about a town called Morrison. Once she said something that made me think she was talking to someone who wasn't in the room, and I almost asked, but then I was somewhere else for a while. I remember cold cloths. She had wet the cloth in cool water and laid it across my forehead, my neck, my wrists. Every time one warmed, she took it away and put a fresh one. I don't know how many times. My hands were at my sides and I felt her fingers on my wrist each time, checking something, the pulse. I understood later, and I lay still for it and tried to help by breathing. At some point in the deepest part of the night, I thought I was going to cross over. I want to say that plainly without making it larger than it was. I felt very far from my body. There was a pulling sensation, gentle like the current of a slow river. I thought of my daughter who had died some years before. I thought of the first horse I ever owned, a bay mare with a crooked blaze. I thought of my wife who had been gone 15 years. I said her name, my wife's name, just quietly, not to anyone. The woman heard it or something like it, and she leaned close and said, "No, stay with me." Not a plea, not a command, just a plain statement like she was telling me something factual. I stayed. I don't know exactly what that means, whether it was her voice or the medicine or just that it wasn't my time. But I heard her say that, and the pulling sensation eased. I came back inside myself, and the pain in my chest was still there, but I was inside it, which is a different thing than being on the outside of it looking in. She was beside me on the ground. She had pulled her coat around herself and sat with her back against the lodge pole and her legs stretched out, and she was watching me, not sleeping, watching. The candle had gone out at some point. I saw it was gone, and there was just the faint gray coming through the smoke hole up top. Almost morning. I said, "You didn't sleep." She said, "No." I said, "You should have." She said, "You weren't stable enough." I looked at the ceiling, the smoke hole, the gray of it. I said, "What is your name?" She said, Clara Marsh." I said my name, the English one. She said, "I know, the boy told me." We didn't say anything for a little while. Then I said, "Why did you come?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Because he asked me to." That's it, that's all she said. I didn't push. She didn't explain. We lay in the gray quiet, and I felt the fever still in me but changed lower, like a fire that has burned through its worst wood and is down to coals. Still hot, but no longer in charge. The next 3 days were slow. Fever like that doesn't leave all at once. It retreats, holds a little ground, retreats again. Clara stayed. I don't think anyone asked her to. I certainly didn't. She just stayed. She slept in the lodge. In the corner, Broken Bow had vacated when he'd seen that she knew what she was doing. She heated broth and made me take it. She changed the cloths when the fever came back up in the evenings, which it did for 2 more nights, though not like before. Never like that first night again. My men were not comfortable with her. I could see that. They were respectful. I was chief, and she had come to help the chief, and they were not fools, but they kept a distance. They spoke around her. They would come to check on me and speak to me as if she wasn't there and then leave. She did not seem bothered by it. She moved through the camp with a kind of steadiness. She didn't hurry and she didn't shrink. She just went about the business of keeping me alive. On the third day, I sat up for the first time. Just sitting. It took more effort than I expected. A man gets humbled fast when his body stops doing what he tells it. I sat there with my back against the lodge pole, the same one she had leaned against that first morning, and felt the sweat cool on me and thought about what it meant to be alive. Clara came in and saw me sitting up and said nothing. She set a cup of broth near my right hand and went back to whatever she was doing. That was something I noticed about her. She didn't make an occasion out of things. Another person would have said something. She just put the broth there, let me drink it if I wanted. I drank it. She asked after a while if I wanted to tell her what the fever had been like. I said no. She said that was fine. She was making notes in a small book, a journal of some kind, full of her careful handwriting and small drawings of plants. She held it close when she wrote, the way a person holds something they've had a long time. I watched her write and thought, this woman has been doing this a long time. The healing, the traveling to it. I said, where do you go from here? She said, I'm not sure yet. I was heading north, somewhere north. I said, that's not a destination. She looked up from the book. Something in her face shifted just slightly, not offended, maybe just seen. Like I'd said something she didn't expect. No, she said, I suppose it isn't. I found out her story in pieces over those 3 days, the way you find most things. She had been a healer's assistant in Ohio before the war. After the war, she had come west with a husband who hadn't lasted long, not the violence kind of not lasting, just the worn-out kind. He died of a lung sickness in the winter of '68. She had kept moving. She had found that there were places out here where her medicines were needed and where nobody cared much about a woman traveling alone as long as she could be useful. She'd spent time at forts, at homesteads, at reservation posts. She spoke a few words of Lakota badly, and she knew enough to know they were bad. She told me these things without self-pity. That was what I noticed. She'd had hard things happen and she reported them the way you report weather. It was cold. Then it warmed. She wasn't asking me to feel sorry for her. She was just telling me who she was. On the evening of the 4th day, the fever broke all the way. I mean the real breaking, the sweat came. A lot of it. And I lay in it for an hour and then it passed and I was just cold and wrung out, and underneath all of that, something I hadn't felt in a week. Hungry. Clara brought me food. Real food, some of what the women in camp had made, and some dried biscuit from her own supplies. I ate it without speaking and she sat across from me and watched, and I didn't mind being watched. She had earned it. I said, you saved my life. She said, the medicine did most of it. And you held on. I said, I heard you tell me to. She looked at me for a moment, the firelight in her eyes. She said, I didn't think you could hear me. I said, I heard you. She didn't say anything to that. I said, I have not thanked you. She shook her head like thanks was beside the point. But I said it anyway, thank you, because it was true and because I wanted her to know I knew what it had cost her. Not the medicines. The night. The sitting there in the dark, watching a man breathe, refusing to leave. She said, you'd have done the same. I thought about that. I said, maybe, but you didn't know that when you came. She was quiet for a beat, then she said, no, I didn't. She stayed for another week after the fever broke. I didn't ask her to. She didn't announce it. She simply remained. She checked on me morning and evening, took me walking a little farther each day, watched my color and my breathing, and asked me the same questions each morning with the seriousness of someone keeping a record. How did you sleep? Does it hurt here? Can you take a deep breath? The second week I started walking on my own, 300 steps, then 500. She came along the first few times, not holding me, just walking beside. We went east of camp to where the creek bent back on itself and there was a stand of cottonwoods, yellowed by the season. I walked slowly. I did not pretend I wasn't walking slowly. She didn't pretend either. We talked those mornings. Not about the fever, I meant it when I said I didn't want to talk about the fever. We talked about other things. She wanted to know about the land, the specific land, what it was called in Lakota and what had happened here, old things. She was interested the way a person is interested when they've been traveling a long time and haven't had anyone to talk to. I answered her. I found I didn't mind it. There is something about telling a person about the land you know, showing them a ridge and saying what it's called and why. That is its own kind of pleasure. You're giving them something real. She told me about Ohio. She told me about what the hospitals had looked like during the war, the ones she'd worked in, and she told me in a way that didn't spare anything but didn't wallow in it either. She'd seen a lot of death. She'd learned to sit with it. She wasn't afraid of it, and I think that was why she'd been able to sit with me through that night without flinching. She'd sat beside enough going out to know what it looked like and what to do about it. I asked her once if she'd been afraid, that first night. She thought about it, she said, not for myself, a little for you. I said, you didn't show it. She said, no use in showing it. I asked her what she'd been afraid of exactly. She looked at the creek for a moment. She said that I'd done everything right and it wouldn't be enough. I understood that. I had felt that in my life more than once. You do everything right and it still might not hold. You know it and you do it anyway. I said, that is the hardest kind of fear. She said, yes. We stood by the creek for a while in the quiet. Broken Bow spoke to me about her on the 10th day. He came to me in the morning while she was down at the creek, and he sat with me the way he does when he wants to say something important, not right at it, circling first. He said the men were talking. I said I expected they were. He said there was some question about when she would go. I said I didn't know. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, carefully, in the measured way of a man choosing words, that she had done a good thing and was a good woman, but that people were not always comfortable with good things that came from unexpected places. I said, what are you saying, Broken Bow? He said, I am saying that you should think about what you want. Then he left. That was Broken Bow. He would get you right up to the edge of the thing and leave you there. I thought about it. She found the grave on her own. I don't know how. She wasn't snooping. I don't think she was the snooping kind, but she must have gone out farther than usual one afternoon and come across it. It was on the rise east of camp, a simple mound with stones arranged on it and a post that had weathered to gray. My wife's grave. She asked me about it that evening. She asked carefully, not pushing, just, is that someone you lost? I said, my wife, 15 years ago. She didn't say she was sorry. I was glad of that. I'd had 15 years of people saying they were sorry and it hadn't changed anything. She just nodded. I said, her name was Cedar Woman. She was the best person I have known. Clara looked at me. She had a way of looking that was very still, not calculating, not soft either, just there, present. She said, tell me about her. So I did. I had not done that in a long time, not properly, not the whole of her. I told Clara about how Cedar Woman had laughed, which was a loud laugh, surprising in a woman who was otherwise so composed. How she had kept her own counsel but always told me the truth. How she had died fast, a sickness of the blood, and I had not been there because I had been 3 days' ride away settling a dispute, and I had not made it back in time. How I had never quite found a way to put that down. Clara listened to all of it. She didn't try to fix it or find the lesson in it. When I was done, she said, she sounds like she was everything. I said she was. Clara said, you've been carrying it alone a long time. It wasn't a question. She wasn't asking. And something about the fact that she wasn't asking, that she could just see it and say it plainly, did something in my chest I wasn't prepared for. Not breaking, just a loosening, a small thing. Like a knot that's been there so long you've forgotten it's a knot. I didn't say anything. She didn't require me to. The question of her leaving came to a head on the 15th day. She had begun packing her things in the morning slowly, the way a person packs when they're not sure yet but feel like they should be starting. I watched her from across the lodge. She took her bottles and wrapped them one by one in the cloth she used for that purpose, and she set them in the leather bag. Her journal went in on top. I said, "You're leaving." She said, "I've been here 2 weeks. I should let you get on with things." I said, "Is there somewhere you need to be?" She paused, the bottle in her hand mid-wrap. She said, "Not exactly." I said, "Then stay." She turned and looked at me. I had not meant to say it quite like that flat and plain, but there it was. I let it stand. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because there is work for you here. Because you know this land now better than most healers who come through. Because the people in the next camp over have needed someone like you since spring. Because—" I stopped. She was still looking at me, her head slightly tilted, the way a person tilts their head when they're listening for the thing underneath the thing being said. I said, "Because I want you to stay." The lodge was quiet. Outside, someone was working with a horse. I could hear the sound of hooves on dry ground, the soft jingle of tackle. She stood there with the bottle still in her hands, and I sat there and did not look away, because I had said a true thing and there was no point in looking away from it. She said, "I'm not Cedar Woman." I said, "I know who you are." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she set the bottle down, not in the bag, back on the ground where she kept things she was still using. She said, "All right." That was all, just all right. She stayed. In the weeks that followed, I watched her become part of the camp the way a rock becomes part of a riverbed, not quickly, not dramatically, just over time, worn into place. She learned names. She treated a child's infected foot and a woman's fever and an old man's joint pain, and she did it the way she did everything, steadily, without making a show of it. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She made mistakes in Lakota and said so. She was not trying to become one of us. She was trying to be useful among us, and that is a different thing, and people could feel the difference. The women warmed to her before the men did, which I could have predicted. She sat with them at their work and didn't get in the way and passed things when asked and said little, and they talked around her. And after a while they talked to her, and after a little while longer they talked with her. A woman named Bright Water, who had been the most skeptical, came to me one morning and said, without preamble in the way of Bright Water, "Your healer woman has good hands," and then walked away. From Bright Water, that was a speech. My men took longer. Men always do. But there was a morning, this was maybe 6 weeks after she'd come, when Little Thunder, the boy who'd ridden to get her, fell off a horse while showing off and landed wrong, and the break was visible from 20 feet away. The arm bent between the elbow and wrist in a way it wasn't meant to bend. Clara was there before I was. She had the boy flat on the ground, talking to him calm and low, and she was already splinting before anyone else had figured out what to do. She set that arm straight and clean, and the boy didn't yell. And when she was done, he looked up at her with a kind of awe that only very young people have for very competent things. After that, the men got easier. I watched her from a little distance those weeks, not the way you watch something unfamiliar, the way you watch something you are glad is there. She moved through her days with a purposefulness I had not seen in a long time, not in myself, not in others, and I recognized what it was. It was a person doing what they were meant to do in a place that needed them to do it. There is a particular quality to that. You can feel it from across a camp. She came to my fire most evenings. We had fallen into it without deciding to. She would finish her day's work and come and sit, and we would talk or we would not talk, and that was equally fine. She drank tea. She kept her journal up to date, writing by firelight, and I had long since stopped wondering what was in it. One night I asked. She looked at me over the journal, the way you look at someone who has asked something slightly impertinent, but not truly impertinent. Then she handed it to me. It was her record of everything she had treated. Dates, conditions, what she had used, what had worked, what hadn't. Detailed notes, dense with her cramped handwriting. And at intervals not labeled as such, there were other passages, shorter, more like impressions. The quality of the light on a particular morning. The sound of the creek after the rains. The way the camp smelled after the first snow. I read one of those passages. It was about me. It said, he carries the whole weight of this place without speaking of it. He holds the line, that is what they say his name means. Someone told me, and I believe it. There is something in him that does not bend. I don't know yet if that's a good thing or a hard thing. Maybe both. I handed the journal back. She had been watching me the whole time. I said, when did you write that? She said, about 3 weeks after I got here. I said, you thought about leaving. She said, I think about most things. I said, and now? She took the journal back and closed it. She held it the way she always held it, both hands against her chest, like something she'd had a long time and didn't intend to lose. She said, and now I am sitting by your fire and I don't think about leaving much. The hard thing came in the late fall. A man from the fort, a lieutenant, young, with the kind of face that had not been outside long, rode into camp and asked to speak with the chief. He was polite about it. He spoke carefully, like a man who knew he was on uncertain ground and had been briefed about it. He said there was a situation with the boundaries agreed in the treaty, something about the eastern grazing land, and the colonel would like to discuss it. The implication was clear enough, even through the polite language. The land was being disputed again. I told him I would come. Clara was there when he came. She had heard it all. When the lieutenant had gone, she came to where I was standing and stood beside me and said nothing for a while. We looked out at the camp, at the kids chasing each other around the far lodge, at the horses along the line. She said, what are you going to do? I said, what I always do, go and talk to them and hold what can be held. She said, is that enough? I said, it never quite is, but it's what we have. She was quiet, then she said, I know some people at the fort, the surgeon, a couple of the officers' wives, people who can carry a word. She said it simply, just laying it out, if it would help. I looked at her. She wasn't offering this to flatter me or to show herself useful. She was offering it because it was what she had and she thought it might matter. A person's connections, their hard-won relationships, those were worth something, and she knew it, and she was putting them on my side of the ledger without being asked. I said it might help. She said, I'll write some letters. And she did. I don't know exactly what she wrote. She didn't show me and I didn't ask. But when I went to the fort 3 days later, the colonel was not easy. Men like that are never easy, but more careful than I had expected. Something had already been said in the right quarters. The negotiation took 2 days and I held most of the eastern grazing land. Not all, but most. When I came back, Clara was waiting at the edge of camp. Not anxious, not pacing, just standing there, watching the direction I would come from. When I rode in, she looked at me and I looked at her, and I knew she could read in my face how it had gone. She said, most of it. I said, most of it. She said, that's something. I said, it is. We walked back into camp together, her beside me, and the evening light was low and orange on the plain, and I felt not happy exactly, because there is always too much not happy in what we deal with for happiness to be the right word. But I felt not alone. For the first time in a long time, working through something hard, I had not felt alone. The snow came early that year. First real snow on the last day of October, and it came hard, 3 days of it, the kind that buries everything and changes the look of the land so you have to relearn where things are. We were ready for it mostly. There had been years of not being ready and we had learned. Clara had seen eastern winters but not plains winters. I watched her learn the difference. She learned fast, the way she learned most things, by paying attention and asking smart questions and not making the same mistake twice. She learned to bank a fire properly. She learned what to eat and when, and what to carry on your body if you were going out. She learned to read the sky. One of the things about that winter I will tell is this. There was an evening, maybe a week into the snow, when most of the camp was inside and there was a stillness over everything that only comes when snow is falling and there is no wind. Just quiet and the snow coming down. I was outside. I had gone to check on the horses, which I did every evening, whatever the weather, and she came out with me. She hadn't been asked. She just came. We stood at the line of horses. They shifted and breathed their cloudy breath, and one of them, a gray mare I'd had for 6 years, put her nose to Clara's shoulder and blew warm air on her. Clara put her hand up and touched the mare's face. She said, "What is she called?" I said the name, in Lakota. She said, "What does it mean?" I said, "Something like the one who comes back." I said, "She went missing once 3 years back and I thought she was gone. She came back on her own after 6 days." Clara looked at the mare for a moment. Then she said, quietly, not to me, kind of to herself and the horse both, "Seems like a good thing to be." I looked at her. The snow coming down on her shoulders, on her hair, the gray of the sky behind her. She was looking at the mare with an expression I recognized because I had felt it myself, a person who has been lost before and knows what it costs and knows what coming back is worth. I said, "Clara." She looked at me. I said, "You came back too. When you came here, you know that." She was still for a moment. Something in her face that she didn't quite cover. Then she said, "Maybe." I said, "Not maybe." She looked at me a long moment in the snow and the quiet. And what was in her face then, I won't try to say it was one thing because it wasn't. It was a woman who had carried things a long time, seeing that someone saw how far she'd carried them, that she wasn't invisible, that what she'd given wasn't just received but known. She put her hand on my arm, just her hand on my sleeve in the cold, but it was solid and warm, and it was her saying, "I know you see me, and I see you back." We stood there in the snow with the horses breathing around us, and I felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for longer than I could rightly name. The weight I had been carrying, the loneliness of the line holder, the man who is supposed to hold while everyone else depends on him, lifted, just a degree. Not gone, but shared. Two people carrying something together carry it different than one person alone. There is a thing that happened in February that I want to tell, because it is part of what I am trying to say about her. One of the younger women in camp, a girl named Singing Water, came to Clara in the middle of the night in some distress I will not go into all the particulars of. Clara got up immediately. No hesitation, no complaint about the hour. She took her bag and she went. She was gone 3 hours. When she came back, it was close to morning, and she was tired in the way that comes from sustained attention rather than just lost sleep. She set her bag down and sat by the fire and poured herself some tea and was quiet. After a while she said, "She's all right, both of them." I said, "The child too?" She said, "The child too." She drank the tea and I got up and put more fuel on the fire. She watched me do it with those tired eyes and then she said, "Thank you." I said, "For the fire." She said, "For this, all of this, for—" She stopped. She shook her head like she was trying to find the right words and they weren't quite there. She said, "For letting me be useful here." I sat back down. I said, "You know we are not letting you be useful. You are useful. Those are different things." She looked at me. I said, "You came here and you decided to do something with what you knew and you have done it. Every day. That is not something we let you do. That is something you did." She held the cup in both hands, 2 hands, solid like she was holding something that might spill. She said, "Not everyone would have." She stopped again. Then she said, "Not everyone would have asked me to stay." I said, "I know." She said, "Why did you?" I had thought about how to answer this in the months since she had come. I said, "Because you came in the dark and you sat through the worst of it and you did not run. Because when the fever broke you were still there. Because you told me to stay, and I stayed, And then I saw what you were, and I thought, the world has not given her enough of the right things, and I have enough land and enough fire to change that if she'll let me." She was very still, the firelight on her face, her eyes bright and steady. She said, "That is a more honest thing than most people say." I said, "I am an old man. I don't have time for the dishonest version." She laughed then, a real laugh, short and surprised, and it was so good to hear that I laughed too, and we sat there in the February dark laughing at something that wasn't quite a joke, and it was one of the better moments I can remember. Spring came the way it comes on the plains, not gentle, just sudden like a door opening. One week the ground was iron and white, the next the creek was moving, and there was a smell of wet earth over everything. Clara's medicines had kept the camp healthier that winter than most winters. We had lost no one to sickness, which was not something I could always say. She had been there for the births, 2 of them, healthy both, and she had been there for the old man whose heart finally wore out, and she had sat with his family through that night the way she had sat with me through mine. She was part of what we were. Not the same as what we were, she was still herself, still Clara Marsh from Ohio with her glass bottles and her journal, but woven in, like she had always been a thread that just hadn't found the right weave. There was a morning in April when I asked her a thing I had not yet asked directly. I said, "Are you staying?" She looked up from the journal. She had been writing at the entrance of the lodge, the morning light on her face. She said, "What kind of question is that?" I said, "An honest one." She put the journal down. She looked at me with that still, level look, the one I had seen that very first night when she'd come in and taken the measure of me lying on the ground. She said, "Joseph." She said my name, the English one, the one she always used. She said it the way a person says a name when they want to make sure you're listening. She said, "I have been here since September. I have treated 43 people, delivered 2 children, sat with 1 man while he died, written 16 letters on behalf of your land negotiations, and learned to bank a fire in a blizzard. I have burned my hands twice on your camp cook fairs, and I have drunk more sage tea than I care to count, and I have learned 4 Lakota words, 3 of which I probably pronounce wrong." She paused. "Does it seem like I'm leaving?" I said, "No." She said, "Then why are you asking?" I said, "Because I wanted to hear you say it." Something in her face softened. Not melted, she was not a melting kind of person, but softened. She said, "I'm staying." I said, "Because there's work here." She looked at me, she said, "Because there is you here." There was a council in June. It is not necessary to go into all of it. Councils are long and complicated, and the complications mostly involve land, which is always the same complication no matter how different the words around it. This one had to do with 3 families wanting to move to a cousin camp 2 days south, and whether the balance of the thing was right. It went all day. I was tired by the end of it, not the kind of tired that comes from hard physical work, which I still did not mind, but the kind that comes from holding many things in your mind at once and keeping the peace between people who are not always interested in keeping it. Clara had not been in the council. It was not her place to be. She had spent the day at her work, and when I came out of the council lodge in the late afternoon, she was at the cook fire with bright water, doing something with dried plants. She looked up and saw my face. She said nothing to bright water, just touched her arm once, a small "excuse me," and got up and came to me. She walked with me away from the cook fire, away from the main part of camp, toward the ridge where we sometimes walked in the evenings. We walked for a while in silence. She didn't ask how it had gone. She had learned that the way to help me after something like a council was not to ask questions but to walk beside me and let the day come off at its own pace. When we got to the top of the ridge, I stopped. The plain spread out below us, gold and wide, the way it looks in the late daylight of June. Miles of it. The camp a small arrangement of shapes in the middle of all that space, and the sky above it, big and full of late clouds going pink at the edges. She stood beside me, close. I could feel the warmth of her shoulder near mine. I said, "Some days I wonder if it's enough." She knew what I meant. She said, "What you do?" I said, "What I do, what I've given, whether it holds." She was quiet, then she said, "It holds." I said, "You don't know that." She said, "I know you, that's the same thing." I turned and looked at her. She was looking at the plane, her jaw set, and there was something in her profile, the weathered skin, the gray at the temples, the steadiness of her, that hit me then not as something new, but as something I had been seeing for months finally coming into full focus. This woman had watched me from the ground up. She had seen me at my worst, burning and helpless, not able to hold anything at all. She had seen me struggling through recovery. She had seen the counsel-tired face and the late-night worry face and the face I made when negotiations went hard. She had seen all of it, and she was still here, standing shoulder to shoulder with me on this ridge, looking out at what I was responsible for and telling me that it held. Not because she was being kind, because she believed it. She turned and found me looking at her. She didn't look away. She said, "Stop wondering if it's enough. It is, you are." And then she reached out and took my hand, both of hers around mine, warm and solid, the rope-redden knuckles, the capable healer's hands. She held my hand the way you hold something you intend to keep, and she looked at me and I looked at her, and the light went pink and slow over the plain below us, and I understood that I had been seen completely by this woman, and that she was choosing to stand with me knowing everything she knew. Not the strong version of me, the full one. The strong and the worn and the uncertain and the grieving and the still here. That man. She was choosing that man. I said nothing. I put my other hand over hers. We stood on the ridge until the light was almost gone. That was 7 years ago. I am not going to tell you everything in between, because some of it is private and some of it would take another 7 years to tell. What I will tell you is this. I woke up this morning before the light and she was already at the fire. She does that, has always done that. The tea was going before I even moved. I watched her from where I was lying, gray in her hair now more than when she came, the same square, wind-burned face, her hands moving with that economy of motion she's always had, no wasted movement, the kind of hands that have spent decades being useful. She was making notes in the journal, the 5th journal now, maybe the 6th, I've lost count. She never starts writing without something to write, which means she's always paying attention to something, storing it. She didn't know I was awake. I lay there and I thought about that night in October, the candle stub and the 4 days of fever and the way she'd walked in and just started working. I thought about the morning it broke and she was still there, sitting up against the lodge pole watching me breathe. I thought about all of it, the creek walks and the snow and the ridge at evening, her hands around mine, her voice saying, "Stop wondering if it's enough. It is. You are." There are men who go their whole lives and nobody sees them the way she sees me. I know that. I have known men like that. I have been that man. I know what it is to carry everything and have nobody know what it weighs. She looked up then, the way she does when she feels eyes on her. She found my face across the fire. She smiled, not a big smile, the small, real one. I got up and went and sat beside her, and she handed me the cup without being asked, and I held it in both hands, the warmth of the sage tea, and the light came up pink over the ridge we had stood on together 7 years ago. The camp was beginning to move behind us, the familiar sounds of mourning, someone calling a child's name, a horse shifting along the line, wood being set on a fire. She went back to writing. I sat beside her and watched the sun come up. The tea tasted like sage, like something strong and plains-grown and real, like something that had been here a long time and intended to stay.